All right, so it's May 2011, Lubbock, Texas. The sun is bright. It's 105 degrees outside, and I am walking through the library drenched in sweat. Just trying to find my way through this cramped little library on Texas State campus. So if you know that feeling where you're completely drenched and you feel goofy walking around soaking wet because you're in an air-conditioned building, and you're just waiting for it to hurry up and dry, that's kind of the situation. So what was I doing, right? I'm walking around through this library where, the ceiling is barely above my head. It's like a scene from Being John Malkovich. What I'm doing is I'm researching for a course on philosophy and world religions that I've got to teach. So I'm wandering around, and what I'm looking for are books on Chinese philosophy. I've got to learn more about Chinese thought, especially the virtues. And my background is in virtue ethics, specifically of Aristotle. And I knew that Confucius also teaches a kind of virtue ethic. So I'm here to learn more about Confucian virtues and, just kind of show how they fit into our tradition in the West, right? So I grab these books, start looking through, and I'm learning more. And that's when I hit a wall, a great wall from China. Not made of bricks, but I ran into the virtue of Li. Of ritual propriety. Okay, so essentially, Confucians believe that one of the cardinal virtues is performing rituals correctly. I'm like, what on earth? Virtue, it's supposed to be about cultivating the soul, developing the interior, building character, not about following rules, much less ceremonial regulations, right? Rituals are boring. They're lifeless. They're performative. They're not authentic. And they seem to merely be about, conforming your behavior to some arbitrary, artificial, external standard. I could not think of anything more unlike virtue than mindlessly going through rituals. But I was already signed up to teach the class, so I had to get to the bottom of it. And what I learned not only changed how I saw the Confucius emphasis on ritual, it also showed me I didn't really understand the tradition in the West as well as I thought. So how is ritual propriety, called Li, how is that a virtue? The strong objection that I had, and that maybe you have, is that, look, virtues develop and cultivate the self. Rituals are merely outward performance, boring, superficial, lifeless, inauthentic. External performance. Well, this brings up a puzzle. My attitude was a very American attitude towards ritual, but that I even have an attitude towards ritual is itself kind of a puzzle. I think many Americans are with me, right? We have a similar attitude towards rituals. We think we can just dispense with them. And yet, a lot of people will say, especially non-Americans, they'll say, we have no rituals, okay? They'll say, we have no culture. And so how do we reconcile this? How can we have such a strong attitude towards rituals if we don't even have them? And, the more I thought about it, the more I looked into it, the more I researched and just reflected, I realized, well, actually, in America, we have many rituals, many ceremonies. There are weddings, funerals. We have all kinds of graduation ceremonies. We have ceremonies for honoring soldiers. So it's not that we lack rituals. And yet, we do have a certain attitude towards rituals. We see them as discontinuous from real life. That is, when you go to a ceremony, whether it's a funeral or a high school graduation, it feels like you're stepping outside of real life, momentarily into this world of ceremony, this world of ritual. And there's just a major contrast between real life and the rituals. And they just seem fake. They seem artificial. And they seem like the kind of things you can just blow off. So we got to figure out, how do rituals fit into life in a Confucian society, or even just a more traditional society? So first, we have to realize we need a broader understanding of what ritual is. Like when we're talking about Li and ritual propriety, it certainly includes scripted ceremonies, But it goes beyond that. It includes things like etiquette. It also includes, it goes all the way up to social roles and the responsibilities and duties that go along with them. So scripted rituals, they may mark special transitions, but really they are to remind us of our social roles and responsibilities as they reinforce a world of roles, rules, and responsibilities that's very active outside of the ceremony itself. And so the picture you start to get, ritual in a Confucian society, it's not a break from ordinary life. It's not a break from an unstructured social world. It is meant to be continuous with it. The scripted rituals, the ceremonies, those are not interruptions of life. They're more like high points, points of focus, when we can really see our social world and our social identity coming into focus. All right, so here's an example. This is a great example of a East Asian society that has been influenced by Confucian values. You see that tea ceremony. You see the archer practicing perfect form. You see the blacksmiths in the village, honing their craft. And this is really kind of an image of this traditional society where ritual propriety is taken not merely as outward performance, but giving you the structure to fully develop your own potential, right? Now, we do have some examples like this still in America. And I have to emphasize, usually this is treated as an East-West divide. I don't think that's quite right. I think it's much more of a modern traditional divide. So we actually have this inheritance in Western Civ. It's just it doesn't survive in many places. One place it survives is the military. So for example, think about the ceremonies associated with the military, like when recruits take their oath, or when they graduate, when they complete basic training. Well, think about how that in turn reinforces the etiquette expected of them. For example, saluting officers. Well, those ceremonies and that etiquette reinforce very real roles and responsibilities. In the military, especially in combat, you have to obey your officers. Okay, you have to obey them. You have to do what they tell you to. You have to follow their commands. And I think we can see in the military that the different roles that people have, they order the social life in the military, and they coordinate the cooperative action of the service members. So think about this. Think about, a squad or a platoon that's, operating. The lieutenant does not have to persuade the corporal. You just got to give him an order. The corporal doesn't necessarily have to understand the lieutenant, but he does have to obey, right? Think about if everyone had to be persuaded of the officer, what the officer's commanding. Think about how slow and inefficient that would be. I mean, does the corporal have to persuade the private, right? Does the lieutenant have to have a separate conversation with every single person under his command, right? I mean, why not just have a big group meeting, okay? It'd be incredibly slow and inefficient, and everything would break down into endless haggling and negotiation. You can also think about it from the perspective of the service members, right? If every order from an officer is up for negotiation, that actually puts a tremendous amount of responsibility on the enlisted men under him, right? Everybody has to be aware of everything all at once, because every decision can be second-guessed, every decision can be negotiated, and that really takes away attention and, you could say cognitive resources from focusing or specializing on, the particular duties that you're to perform. So you think of an analogy like a football team. Football team's a great example, American football. Great example of a team effort that has specialized roles and responsibilities. Think about how bad it would be if, the quarterback couldn't call the plays. That every player on the offense was responsible at every moment for giving their 2 cents. Imagine if we picked the quarterback every series, right? A new person might play the role of quarterback every series or even every game, right? It would discourage players from focusing or specializing on their role. Think about it. If maybe you're a tight end, but if the next game you could be the quarterback, that open door, those possibilities actually keep you from specializing, focusing on what it means to be a good tight end, and developing the capacities that will help you be good at that. And if you start to think about all the open doors, all the possibilities that now all of a sudden you have to think about, I mean, it might even induce anxiety. Like you're not going to be focusing. You're not going to be able to concentrate, right? You're going to be aware and trying to keep track of way too many things. So after a little bit of time researching and reflecting, I figured, I pretty much have this down. I've got the solution. Rituals do different work in an American society and a Confucian society. That is, in America, rituals are largely discontinuous from life. Life is structured by different goals, different pursuits. So think about how we divide up life between, the workplace and the home. Well, when you're at work, you are pursuing money, right? You are pursuing pure means. And really, at least in the traditional 20th century American workplace, that means you really come under a discipline where you have to devote your time and attention to whatever job is being given to you. And you really have to curtail your desires, your preferences in order to do a good job. On the other hand, when you go home, it's entirely different. Like the home has become a place of pure consumption. Well, what gives us the order of the home? Well, seeking pleasure, enjoying leisurely pursuits, satisfying desires. And so in a world like that, that's kind of divided up between, pure pursuit of wealth and success and efficiency at work versus mere consumption and satisfying desires at home. The rituals and the ceremonies, they really don't seem to fit in with that. And so they survive for us only in fragmentary form. But they increasingly become strange, right? They're increasingly at odds with the dominant ways that we organize social life. Whereas in Confucian society, the rituals, the roles, those structure society as a whole, as they make society into a cohesive whole. The roles and the rituals, they ensure that there's smooth and fluid cooperation. They prevent coordination problems from arising. They help us to preserve cognitive and psychological resources. Think about it, like not everything has to be calculated out. Not every decision has to be, a decision to optimize. And so when you kind of fall into your roles and responsibilities, it really gives you a break. It gives you relief from constantly having to engage in strategic reasoning. How can I maximize my preferences right now? How can I make sure I get the most money, the most wealth? How can I get the most out of this job? Or, how can I have the most fun? All that kind of stuff. When you have a life that is structured by these recognized rituals and, I guess more importantly, social roles and duties, then you focus on that. And that actually gives your mind a break. You can kind of rest in your role. All right, so that's the conclusion that I initially came to. And I was pretty proud of myself, and I think it's true that rituals and social roles do perform this work. However, I had forgotten what the original problem was. How is how is ritual propriety a virtue? Remember, virtues correspond to something natural, something internal. They bring out a certain potential of the soul. And with the story I just gave about rituals and social roles, solving coordination problems, that's really consistent with them just being necessary evils. It could be that the best strategy for solving coordination problems is also one that does a certain amount of damage to your soul. Sometimes, when Thomas Hobbes talks about the social contract, that's what it looks like. For the sake of security and prosperity, it's worth it to enter the social contract. But in doing so, it looks like maybe you're sacrificing something. Maybe you're mutilating your soul. So we might be able to accept that, individuals reason that they can more efficiently achieve their goals of prosperity and security by agreeing or contracting to burdensome social roles. The roles may be an optimizing strategy of a kind, and yet they still represent a certain kind of loss, a psychological loss. Okay, virtues cultivate the self, they develop its potencies. So how can we account for how ritual can cultivate the self rather than just mutilating it? So to understand ritual propriety as a virtue, something that completes you, something that makes you better, something that actualizes your potential, something that answers or corresponds to your nature, we've got to understand the Confucian conception of self. So this involves a little bit of a contrast. I'm going to say Western, but really I should say modern. I think this way of looking at the social world is pretty new. I think it's only a few centuries old. So I'm just going to call it modern. And the way we tend to see the self is as a self-contained individual. So what happens in social life? It's a bunch of atomic individuals, self-contained individuals. We come together to make a contract. And that means that all social roles are contingent. They're never essential. That is, all social roles are external to the true self. And they're chosen based on how they further goals we already had. That is, we come onto the scene with these pre-social goals, and we only adopt the social roles to further these other interests, right? So that means the self is ultimately intelligible prior to any social roles. That's a very typical modern view. This is not the traditional Confucian view. On the traditional Confucian view, the self is partially constituted by the social roles. There are no self-contained individuals. Every person is always a character. And think of this kind of in the narrative sense, like all the world is a stage, right? From Shakespeare. Everyone is a character embedded within a social fabric and comes onto the scene with social roles and duties. And let me emphasize, social roles and duties that you did not choose. And living well and doing well is always going to be evaluated with respect to the performance of these social roles and duties. And this naturally brings up an objection. Well, does that mean there's no individual? Are you saying you don't believe in individuals? Let me offer a way of thinking about individuality. It's a little different. And I'm going to borrow a little bit from Philip Rieff, great 20th century thinker and critic of modern society. And he actually argues that individuality comes from rules and restrictions. And the way he sees it, look, desires and impulses, those don't actually make you that different from anybody else. We all have the same fundamental desires. We all have the same fundamental impulses. So desires and impulses, they're all the same. We all come onto the scene with the same basic desires. I mean, we can experience fear, appetite, sexual desire, desire for excitement and stimulation. Everyone has these. Those don't really distinguish people. What distinguishes you, what makes you an individual, is precisely accepting the restraints, accepting the prohibitions on your desires, and the work that's done for you to pursue a good life in light of these constraints. That's where character really comes from. And that's actually the source of individuality. So applying that to the Confucian society, we would just go a step further and say that the differentiated social roles, the way that you're bound to different people, like your parents or your children or your neighbors, the particular neighbors that you happen to have, that navigating those roles, those responsibilities to those people, that's where true individuality emerges. That is, you're only ever a self or a person in relation to other people. And I think probably the natural response is something of a metaphysical objection. It's like, well, isn't the soul, kind of self-contained? And you might think of Descartes, and I think, therefore I am. And this idea of the self as a metaphysical substance. I will say that is not the view in most Chinese thought, certainly not Confucian. But I don't want to put that entire perspective on you, but just think of it like this. Whether or not you believe there is some kind of metaphysical substance that is yourself, in terms of what makes a good man or a good woman, in that sense, there's no intelligible conception of a good man or a good woman, or a good son, or a good father, or a good neighbor, or a good citizen, apart from the social roles and duties. And if we start to understand the way traditional Confucian society understands social roles as partially constituting the self, then we can start to see how ritual propriety is actually a virtue. You're learning to inhabit these roles and responsibilities. You are developing your character to fully manifest in these roles, to perform them well. And it's not about just outward performance. Confucius is very clear that he expects an inner cultivation. You have to learn. As the rules, the ceremonies, they remind you of what you should become. And one example that's often used in Confucian literature is proper funeral rites for parents. This is not merely a scripted ceremony to perform while your mind is somewhere else. I'll give you an example. Recently, I was at a graduation for my daughter, and like almost everyone in there was on their phones the entire time. Like no one wanted to be there. Like they had to be there, but there's a sense where everyone wanted to be somewhere else. They were there in body, but their attention, their minds were somewhere else. They were glued to their phones. That is not ritual propriety. Ritual propriety is learning to discipline yourself and cultivate the right attitudes and feelings appropriate to the situation. And so the more that I began, learning about Confucian society and social roles, I started looking at our situation a little differently, and I realized we actually still do have a lot of fragments of a robust, deeply textured social world. But increasingly, we don't understand it. And that's a problem for us. So if you want to start thinking about what's been lost and the possibilities for a social world that's more structured, that has something for you to develop into, for you to find yourself in relation with other people, then Confucian thought is a great place to start engaging in that project of self-criticism and even retrieval. So in summary, ritual propriety is about self-cultivation, but the idea is that the self is a relational self. It's never just two self-contained individuals. Individuals are always in relation to others, and there is an order, you might even call it a sacred order, that always mediates between them. And in order to be the best you can be, or to be most fully yourself, is to learn to fully inhabit this order in relation with other people.